Hey guys, it's Dr. Justin Marcagiani here. Today we're going to be doing a quick video along with the Q&A. The topic will be about the truth about gluten sensitivity. Is gluten affecting me? We're going to dive into that topic. Please smash that like button. Really helps the search algorithm. Put your comments down below. Really like to get to know what you guys are thinking. All right, let's dive in. So what's gluten? Gluten is the major protein in wheat, barley, and rye. Now, typically there are other foods that are like so-called gluten-free. That's rice, corn, let's see here, rice, corn, oats. Those are some big one. Um, and these, again, they're in the same big umbrella family of gluten, right? So like the brothers and sisters, they're not the actual gluten itself. And so these other proteins, like we have the major protein in wheat is gliadin, the major protein in rice is horsinin, the major protein in corn is zein, the major protein in oats is avenin. So these are different proteins. They look similar. They share a family resemblance. And so when you eat some of these foods, they can create inflammation. They can do it via a couple of different mechanisms. We'll kind of break down the different mechanisms and how that's happening. So one, just the inflammatory nature of these foods because of potential pesticide residue, GMO, Roundup. There's one component there. So another component of the gliadin protein actually increasing gut permeability. And so imagine you have these tight junctions, these epithelial cells in the intestinal tract, and they start to unzip. This is called a leaky gut or gut permeability. That allows a lot of the undigested food proteins to get into the bloodstream, and that can create inflammation. And so when your immune system starts seeing proteins that shouldn't be there, and these proteins have a molecular, let's say, the surface protein amino acid sequence looks similar to other tissues in the body, like the thyroid, like nervous tissue, you can have an immune attack attacking the thyroid or attacking different tissue in the body. You can go just on PubMed, Google, and just type in Hashimoto's and gluten, or you can type in MS and gluten. There's a lot of connection. Gluten is connected with dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of different autoimmune condition. Part of the underlying mechanism is this gut permeability and these things getting into the bloodstream and creating an immune response. That's number one. Number two is they can also create inflammation in the body just via the nature of these foods. Many people have allergenicity to gluten. So outside of just the gut permeability, you can develop an issue with that food. Also, there's an intolerance aspect. Intolerance is where you just can't break that protein down. People know that with like lactose intolerance, where they'll give you a lactate milk and they'll add a whole bunch of the lactase enzyme to break it down. So the inability to break down that protein can also create inflammation because that food's not broken down. It's sitting there and you can develop an intolerance. So you have an intolerance on one side, you have food allergenicity, which is more of an immune response. You have gut permeability, leaky gut. You have the other types of collateral type of inflammation from Roundup and pesticide residue. Also, grains are going to be higher on FODMAP. So if you have bacterial imbalances, these foods can drive dysbiosis if you already have some bugs that are out of whack in your gut too. Now, how do we test for gluten sensitivity? One of the first things you can do is just pull gluten out. When I say gluten, I'm really talking about all grains because you have the wheat, barley, rye, right? But then you have the corn, oats, rice, right? And then you have the different pseudo grains like quinoa. Quinoa is kind of in that family as well. It's kind of more of a pseudo seed. But you have these other grains, and if you're overly sensitive, you could still develop an immune response to these foods. So I would have you go cut 100% grain-free, and that really allows any of that potential mistaken identity, that molecular mimicry, that cross-reactivity, it pulls it out of the equation. And then the question is, do you feel better? Right? Do you have less inflammation in your joints? Do you feel better? Do you have more energy? Do you have less brain fog? These are all important questions you'd want to ask yourself. And if you notice an improvement, that's a good sign that you should probably keep those foods out. Also, when you start to plateau symptom-wise, let's say over a couple of weeks, you're starting to feel better, you're starting to feel pretty stable, start to add a little bit of these foods back in. How do you feel? How does that challenge feel? Do you start to feel a little bit worse? These are good ways to kind of know. Also, other foods I typically would cut out along with gluten or grains in general. I would also cut out nuts and seeds. I'd also cut out even eggs. Even I love eggs too. They're so good, or butter. I go on a full-on autoimmune type of paleo template as a starting point. If that's too much for you, just start off with the paleo template. Just cut out grains, legumes, and dairy. Start there. See how you feel. Once you get really clean, right, metaphorically, and you start to add something back in that dirties you up, you notice it, right? Because you created this massive contrast. You've reduced inflammation. So when you add something in again that's more inflammatory, you notice that big jump up. And so regarding testing, I would say an elimination, provocation. Elimination means you pull it out. Provocation means you test it. You introduce something back in. There's also blood tests that you can do, whether it's transglutaminase antibodies, endomysial antibodies, deaminated gliadin. These are looking at the different proteins on the gluten or the endomysial or transaminase, looking at these different translational enzymes that impact the nerves in the gut. There's that component there too. You can also do an endoscopy, right? Endoscopy, I don't love it because you have a lot of late stage indication of whether or not there's a sensitivity. And so you're looking at the microvilli, you're looking for a flattening of those microvilli. And so typically there's like what's called in endoscopy world, like a Marsh score. And I think it's Marsh score 2 to 3 is that flattening of the villi starts to happen. And that indicates microvilli, indicates gluten sensitivity. That indicates gluten sensitivity. So Marsh score 1 is normal. These are the microvilli. As they flatten, that's like a Marsh score 2, Marsh score 3, and then totally flat, that's a Marsh score 4. So it's 1 through 4. And so that's what your gastro person would look at and probably rank you on that scale. And so there has to be a lot of prolonged inflammation for that villi to shrink. And the microvilli are important because these are the little mini vacuum cleaners in your small intestine that suck up nutrients. And so the more you inflame those nutrients, the more you clog that vacuum cleaner with sucking up your minerals, your iron, your calcium, your magnesium, your zinc, really important minerals, magnesium. Also the amino acids, all your proteins that play a major role with your brain function, serotonin, sleep, dopamine, tyrosine, right? This is going to be really important for focus and feeling good. And GABA, really important for relaxing, calming down, kind of downshifting from the stress in your day. So these are important things to look at when you are trying to, understand the damage that's happening. And so you have the endoscopy part. We talked about the blood test. We talked about the endoscopy. You can do stool tests too, and you can look at antibodies from the stool perspective. This is better because you're getting an antibody that's closer to the gluten, right? Gluten's in your intestinal tract, your stool is moving through there. So you have a greater chance of having more of an immune response. Also, interepithelial lymphocytes, IEL. These are blood cells in the intestinal tract, and those are going to be there because the gluten is creating an immune stress. So important to think about. So in general, gluten sensitivity is real. Many people who are gluten sensitive don't ever get picked up as celiac. Imagine like the big Venn diagram, right? In the middle, here is gluten sensitivity. It's the big circle. And then you have the overlap with celiac is the smaller circle in the middle that gets basically gets overlap with, okay? And so you have gluten sensitivity. Most people, I would say, have it. 70 to 80% of the population are going to have some level of inflammation, whether it's energy, mood. Remember, most gluten sensitive symptoms are not even intestinal. So when I say, hey, you have gluten issues, they're thinking bloating, they're thinking gas, diarrhea, digestion, constipation. Guess what? It may just be brain fog and fatigue and mood issues and sleep issues, right? So you have to open yourself up to symptoms that are extra intestinal, right? Outside of the intestinal tract. So that's the big one out of the gates there. And so big thing is gluten sensitivity. That's the big umbrella. The small umbrella is the celiac. Celiac requires a lot of damage, a lot of inflammation specific in the intestinal tract, a lot of that microvilli wearing, a lot of neurological or antibodies specific to damaging that intestinal tract. And so you may not have that, but you could have other issues. You could even have other issues, right? I have Hashimoto's. Many people have Hashimoto's. That's an autoimmune thyroid issue. Other people have other types of neurological issues going on where they're making antibodies to attack certain tissue. And that can be significantly impacted by the gluten leaky gut connection. And so, yes, gluten sensitivity, big umbrella. You got to look at different ways you can test for it, diet-wise, empirically with your food, looking at blood tests, looking at stool tests. These are great ways to look at it. And the big 5 mechanisms of how gluten can impact you. We talked about just food allergenicity. We talked about pesticide residue, glyphosate, Roundup. We talked about intolerance, not being able to break the foods down. Talked about leaky gut. These are all important things to look at. And then just nutrient deficiencies. The more you inflame the gut, the more you're going to impact your body's ability to absorb nutrients. All right, guys, hope that makes sense. Regarding gluten symptoms to go away, there's some data that says if you're like celiac and you're looking at like an immune response, it could take up to 6 months for antibodies to come down in some cases. Again, the healthier you are, it could just be a day or two. If you have significant autoimmune already, you have known celiac, you have known, let's say, MS, it could take quite a while for those antibodies to come down. So you really want to be careful. I tell patients, if you're pretty healthy, no known autoimmune conditions, and you feel good, there's always that 80-20 rule, and try to maybe just do things that are grain-free, do siete chips, do cassava, do yuca. If you feel really good overall, you could always sub in some white rice here and there. I don't think it's a huge deal for most people. Some people, like myself, I may do white rice like once a month, right? And I'll do extra enzymes, maybe some extra charcoal as well to kind of bind things up. So you got to look at where you're at, how healthy you are. The more healthier you are, the more you should be able to adapt. If you have known autoimmune genetic predisposition, then you got to be a little bit more careful with that. Use more enzymes, try to find grain-free substitutions like potato, like cassava or yucca. These are better options than just doing corn and such. Is low motivation a lack of energy or dopamine or catecholamine? So let me connect it to gluten, right? Because we're on the topic of gluten. So if I have issues with my gluten sensitivity, and that's causing some gut permeability and impacting my digestion, and I'm not breaking down amino acids. And let's say I'm not breaking down certain amino acids that are going to help with dopamine or help with adrenaline. If I have focus issues, yeah, having low dopamine from not breaking down enough amino acids for dopamine, that can be a thing. Also, the more stressed you are, you're going to burn up dopamine, right? That's part of the reason why when you stress, you burn up dopamine, and that then causes you to have more sweet cravings or have focus issues, right? Because dopamine is really important for focus, and you will actually use sweets and other recreational stimulants to bring up dopamine. So the key is, one, try to manage the stress and the inflammation to begin with. Two, fix your gut. If your gut's driving that inflammation and you're not getting enough of the nutrients in via your diet, yeah, you want to improve that. And you can also use supplements to help improve dopamine as well. So you would do it on the with tyrosine, potentially L-Dopa as well. And it could be both. Dopamine and adrenaline are cut from the same cloth. It goes dopamine, and then it goes L-Dopa, and then it goes it goes, see here, we're talking about dopamine. It's going to go phenylalanine, tyrosine, then it's going to go L-Dopa, dopamine, and then it goes adrenaline or catecholamines down here. So the more stressed you are, you'll pull that dopamine right downhill. Hope that helps. Is rye okay? So wheat, barley, rye. No, that's going to have gluten in there. So you have like wheat, barley, rye, or your like gluten, like your gluten grains. But then you have your gluten-free ones that still have that crossover. That's going to be corn, rice, and oats. Then you kind of have your pseudo grains like quinoa. Then you have things like amaranth that's like a gluten-free grain as well. So those can all play a major role with that. Melatonin wouldn't necessarily impact dopamine. Melatonin is going to be downstream from serotonin. So you're going to see it like this. It's going to go tryptophan. It's going to go 5-hydroxytryptophan, or 5-HTP for short. That's going to go to serotonin and then melatonin. And again, melatonin is technically a hormone made by the pineal gland, but the building blocks for it are all protein-based. And again, if you have issues with protein, not enough stomach acid, you're stressed, you're inflamed, that can definitely be impaired. Also, melatonin, or I should say serotonin, is really important for gut motility as well. Really important. Do you have a good food list for your clients? I do. I have the Justin Health eating plan. That's something I give out to patients specifically. But on my eating plan, I have a handful of different diets that I'll use. Maybe 5 to 8 diets. Again, sometimes I'll overlap them. Again, I see a lot of patients that have a lot of health issues. So sometimes we got to really dig deep and figure out, how nuanced that diet has to be. Sometimes we're just coming out of the gates with just a simple whole food, really good kind of organic eating plan. It just depends, right? Everyone's a little bit individual, and some can be a little bit looser and less strict. Some got to be really tight because they have known health issues and known autoimmune conditions. So we just got to individualize. Excellent. So in regards to kind of everything else here, hope that makes sense. So when someone says, hey, you're not gluten sensitive, only 1%, 1 to 2% of the population is celiac. Just kind of remember that. But I would say up to 80 to 90% or more are going to have some level of gluten sensitivity. Oh, I forgot the genetic testing, right? So genetic testing is helpful. So you'll have the celiac kind of genes are going to be HLA, DQ2 and 8. That's human leukocyte antigen 2 and 8. If you have any of those, you're at a much higher risk for celiac. Now, even though you have those genes, there's still only a few percentage point chance that you're even going to have celiac. But this is the issue, right? Because gluten requires such an end stream level of inflammation, typically to be picked up, you can still have problems that don't manifest at that pathological celiac level, right? You can have the brain fog and mood issues and fatigue, but you don't ever hit that level. Then you have kind of the gluten sensitive genes, which are going to be the alpha 1 and beta 1. These are going to be the alpha 1, beta 1, as well as the 3 HLA DQ alpha 1, beta 1, and HLA DQ3 genes. So there's different tests you can do. You can do a swab or a blood test on that will look at kind of your HLA DQ. And that will give you a good idea where you sit. I think there's only one genotype that is not gluten sensitive. That's the HLA DQ4. Only a few percentage points of the population have that. So it's kind of on the rare side. So if patients are interested, I say, hey, do that test. That can be helpful. Some are like, hey, let me do a food allergy test. Well, the problem is you have to develop, you have to have an immune response to the gluten to actually be able to pick it up. What if you're having inflammation due to gluten, but you're not having an immune response due to the gluten? Then it may not get picked up, right? So that's kind of the problem. If you're relying purely on a response, food antibody response, it may not get picked up. And so I always tell patients, especially if you have issues, elimination provocation is the easiest out of the gate because if you feel better, that's a great sign. Plus, gluten doesn't contain some magic nutrients that other green vegetables or other healthy root vegetables or other healthy lower to moderate glycemic fruits have. Those are still loaded with B vitamins and other bioflavonoids and potassium, magnesium. You don't get some higher amount of nutrients in grains than you do those. And so it's not like you're missing something. If you're not missing something and the inflammatory load is much lower in other foods and the nutrient density is just as high, if not higher, nothing to miss in it. So that's kind of where you look at it. And plus, it's mostly going to be carbohydrate. And most patients, they don't need more carbs. They need more protein and fat. And then we adjust the carbs according to kind of your activity level and if you're at a healthy weight or not. You're at a healthy weight, you can do more carbs. If you're not at a healthy weight, you're less active. You have higher insulin levels, fasting insulin levels, maybe some higher A1C, or you have a glucose tolerance that's way off, right? A functional glucose tolerance, get a Freestyle Libre 3, put it on the back of your tricep, measure your blood sugar for 2 weeks, see how you do after a meal. If you can't bring your blood sugar back below 100 inside of 2 to 3 hours after a meal, you got a problem. Hope that makes sense. Oh, thanks for the compliments there, Carol. Appreciate it. I know for sure I have gluten sensitivity. I was diagnosed with IBS in my 20s. Now in my 50s, I still have problems with gluten. Yeah, exactly. And so typically, if you have issues with gluten, replace the grains with greens, right? Typically green vegetables are going to be much better. If you need a starch, you can always play around with white potato without the skin. You can always play around with sweet potato. There's a brand called Siete that's really good. There's a Mexican family that has an autoimmune condition, and they wanted to still kind of have some of the classic starchy Mexican foods, right? Tacos, soft shell, tortillas, chips, and they created a brand that uses coconut flour or almond flour or cassava yucca flour. So they have a couple different lines of products. And so it's good because a lot of those are autoimmune friendly, especially the yucca based ones. As long as you have no issue with nuts or coconut, you're in pretty good shape. Excellent. So in general here, gluten sensitivity can be exacerbated by dysbiosis, by other gut infections, because the more permeable your gut is, the more likely the proteins of foods that you have a problem with get into the bloodstream, which then that aggravates an immune response. And so the more you have dysbiosis, that's like an imbalance in the bad bacteria versus the good. You have more bad than good as a percentage. You could have H. pylori, you could have other infections. So the more inflamed your gut is, it's going to make you more sensitive to the foods you're eating. And so keep that in mind. So if you have chronic food allergens or issues, you got to look at the gut. You got to get rid of the dysbiosis. That's a good option for you out of the gates. Yeah, you mentioned the Siete products. Yeah, they are higher in carbs. So you have to look at yourself as an individual and see what can I handle from a carb standpoint and just adjust it. That's the way to do it. And if you can't handle much of that, then yeah, stick to lower glycemic vegetables. That's a better way to do it. What's the best way to reverse insulin resistance? So first off is you got to quantify it. Like how much overweight are you? What's your fasting insulin, right? What are your insulin resistant markers? And then I recommend get a functional glucose meter or a continual glucose meter. I like the Freestyle Libre 3. Just have the little sensor, put it on the back of your tricep, hooks up to your app, and then you can measure your blood sugar every minute of every day. Okay, there's some Bluetooth there, but hey, it's excellent. And then you can see what a meal does to you. Also, you can see what moving after a meal does. Just go for a 5 or 10 minute walk after a meal at a decent pace, and you'll see your blood sugar drop 10, maybe 20, maybe even 30 points in 10 minutes just with getting some good movement in. And so depending on where you're at, that can be a great tool. You go to eat maybe a higher carb meal, not the best for you, but hey, you go for a 10-minute walk, not enough to upset your tummy, but then you're going to see your blood sugar drop down. So that's a good option if you're wanting to have a little bit of carbs, but also mitigate the damage. Yeah, so supplement wise, you can also add an extra magnesium. We can add an extra chromium, zinc, vanadium. These are all good nutrients. We can add an alpha lipoic acid, gymnema. What else do I use? Bitter melon, cinnamon. These are all excellent herbs and nutrients that can help with that insulin receptor sensitivity and help your body metabolize and deal with blood sugar better. So great questions there. Awesome. So next step, first thing is, right? Good proteins, good fats at each meal. Get the glutens out, get the grains out in general. See how you feel, right? Not everyone has to be ultra strict. I'd say most people do. And then from there, if you're still having issues, look at getting your gut fixed. Look at plugging in other safer starches instead of grains. So if you need the carbs, just plug in some other safe starch, root vegetables that are going to hit your macro goals, but not have the same inflammatory load. One more question here. My husband has leukemia. His glucose is usually 70 to 80. He ate pizza, and the next day his glucose was 111 via a blood draw by his doctor. So the problem is that's kind of the mistake. You never want to look at it the next day because you're going to see the problem in that first 2-3 hours after a meal. Typically, you have a meal, let's say you're at 80, your blood sugar pops up. You don't really want it to go ever above 140. There's literature showing that once you go above 140, you're starting to increase glycation, increase oxidative stress in the body, and actually even create damage and inflammation. So you never want to go above 140. So 140 is kind of like hey, my danger zone. So in that first hour, I never want to go above 140, ideally 120 to 140 in that first hour. And I want to be back below 100 in hour 2. Definitely hour 3. And so this issue, yeah, you ran it in the morning at 111, probably 8 to 10 hours later, but you've had 8 to 10 hours to get that blood sugar down. You would have seen lots of issues in those first couple of hours. So that's really why you want a continual glucose meter that'll pick it up. And again, you can use a regular meter and just test it on the hour, get a fasting reading and do 1, 2, 3, 4, and you'll see it. It'll be clear as day. Because when your blood sugar stays high, the reason why it's staying high is because your body's making so much insulin, but the cells are still so numb to it, it's not enough to pull the glucose in. And so that's what's telling you about the insulin resistance. How does Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism affect glucose? Well, number one, if your Hashimoto's is elevated, that means your immune response, by definition, is overstimulated or over elevated. And that means your immune system is actually attacking bodily tissue, creating inflammation. The more you create inflammation, there's a cortisol response to then kind of quench that inflammation. If you're having a cortisol response, you can also increase your blood sugar, right? Everyone knows this that's been prescribed hydrocortisone or prednisone. The doctor will say, be careful because you can cause diabetes. Thus, you can also create bone fractures, osteoporosis, because it also breaks down your tissue. And so it can just be through mobilization of cortisol that can increase the blood sugar. Also, when your metabolism is lower, you're going to process glucose less. So if you have a lower metabolism, you're not going to be able to burn it as efficiently. So I would say the big mechanisms and why or how thyroid could impact glucose would be through an autoimmune sign of inflammation and cortisol, thus creating and mobilizing more glucose, and thus your metabolism being lower due to that autoimmune attack, which would also potentially decrease your ability to metabolize it. Regarding Madagascar periwinkle, I don't really know about that. I don't have a comment on that. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, let me know. Put your comments down below. If you enjoyed it, share with friends or family. I appreciate it. And you guys have a phenomenal day. If you want to reach out, you want more support, again, you can reach out. There's a link down below where you can schedule with myself. I'm available worldwide for functional medicine consult support. There'll be a link where you can reach out if you want to dive in and get to the root of what's happening with your own specific health challenges. All right, guys, have a phenomenal day. Take care.